The aircraft wasn't supposed to be there, not on that heading, not at that speed, and certainly not flying directly toward a US aircraft carrier. Yet the radar track told a clear story. This was no coincidence. The carrier group, a US Navy carrier strike group, was operating in international waters during a routine deployment. The carrier sat at the center, flanked by destroyers and cruisers, forming layered rings of defense. Above it all, combat air patrols rotated methodically. Below the surface, submarines moved unseen. Everything about the formation screamed readiness, and that was precisely why the next event mattered so much. First detection. The first alert came not from the carrier's radar, but from an escort ship. Fast-moving airborne contact, long range, inbound. The track was steady, no deviation, no altitude changes, no attempt to avoid detection. It was flying straight in. Classification. Within moments, systems refined the profile. Large airframe, high endurance, strategic range, a Russian long-range bomber. Why this is serious? Russian bombers do not accidentally fly toward carrier groups. These aircraft are designed to simulate anti-ship strikes, coordinate with maritime forces, test carrier defenses. When they approach directly, it's never casual. It's calculated. Unverified. Bomber type. Unverified OSINT analysis later suggested the aircraft matched the profile of a Tu-22M or Tu-95 class bomber, both capable of carrying long-range anti-ship missiles. No official confirmation of the aircraft type or payload was released, but the implication was unmistakable, the heading that set off alarms. As the bomber closed distance, analysts noticed something troubling. Its approach vector lined up almost perfectly with the carrier's axis of movement. This wasn't a pass-by, it was an intercept geometry. The carrier goes alert. Inside the carrier's combat direction center, posture changed, tracking priority elevated, air defense coordination tightened. Every second mattered now. Still, no weapons were armed. This was discipline. Why directly toward is a red line. In military aviation, intent is inferred from movement, and direct approaches reduce decision time, mimic real attack profiles, force defensive postures. At sea, that's how wars begin. Unverified, payload uncertainty. There was no confirmation whether the bomber was armed. Russian aircraft frequently fly without live ordnance during signaling missions, but commanders cannot assume that in real time. Assumptions get ships sunk, the distance closes, the range ticked down, 800 kilometers, 700, 600, still no turn, still no climb, still no radio contact. The silence, standard aviation safety calls were transmitted, no response. The bomber maintained speed, maintained course, maintained pressure. The first decision point. At this range, the carrier group had options: intercept early and escalate visibly, hold position and gather intelligence, adjust formation and signal caution. They chose patience. For now, unverified, command intent. Unverified sources later suggested commanders wanted to observe the bomber's behavior longer to determine whether this was a signaling run or a simulated strike rehearsal. That distinction mattered. The bomber descends. Then something changed. The bomber's altitude began to drop, not rapidly, deliberately. This was the moment every operator recognized, because altitude changes near carrier groups mean one thing: simulation. Why altitude matters. Long-range bombers descend to reduce radar detection, mimic missile launch profiles, compress reaction windows. This was no longer ambiguous. The carrier air wing prepares. Above the carrier, fighters already airborne tightened their orbits. Below deck, additional aircraft were readied, engines cold, pilots standing by. No scramble yet, but everyone knew what came next depended on the bomber. Unverified, missile-run geometry. Unverified analysts later noted the bomber's descent angle aligned with anti-ship missile release envelopes used in training. There was no evidence of missile release systems being activated, but geometry tells its own story. The second warning. Another radio transmission went out. Clear, professional, firm. Still no response. The bomber pressed on. The moment it became a big mistake. At this distance, the carrier strike group's defensive layers were fully awake. Every radar, every sensor, every fighter pilot. The bomber wasn't approaching a single ship anymore. It was approaching an entire system designed to stop exactly this, and it was about to find out what that meant. Cliffhanger. The bomber had made its point, but now it faced a choice: turn away or force the US Navy to respond. What happened next would determine whether this encounter ended as theater or as a lesson. The bomber kept coming, not recklessly, not erratically, just steadily, as if daring the carrier strike group to blink. From the combat displays across multiple ships, the same truth crystallized. This was no casual overflight. The geometry was too clean, the timing too precise, the approach too direct. This was pressure. the carrier system awakens. A carrier is not a ship, it's an ecosystem. The moment the bomber crossed a critical range threshold, that ecosystem reacted, not with chaos, but with choreography. Tracking priority elevated across the network, sensor fusion tightened, data links synchronized every platform into a single picture. No one shouted, no alarms blared unnecessarily, because this is what carrier strike groups are built for. The fighters adjust. High above the carrier, combat air patrol fighters subtly altered their orbits. No dramatic turns, no afterburners, just small changes in position that meant everything. Angles improved, intercept timelines shortened, weapons readiness quietly increased. This wasn't escalation, it was preparation. Unverified, air wing posture. Unverified reporting later suggested additional aircraft were moved to immediate readiness below deck, including fighters configured for air-to-air missions. No official confirmation was released, and exact numbers remain unknown, but readiness was unmistakable. Why the bomber had already lost control of the situation. Strategic bombers rely on distance. Their power lies in standoff weapons, missiles launched far beyond visual range, guided by sensors and coordination. By flying directly toward a carrier group, the bomber was compressing its own advantage. Every kilometer closed favored the defenders. The bomber descends again. Then came the move that changed everything. The bomber dropped altitude. Again, not a dive, a controlled descent, enough to simulate a missile release phase, enough to trigger a decisive shift. Why this is a turning point. Altitude changes at this stage force defenders to make choices, hold and risk being late, escalate and risk misinterpretation, signal and hope the message lands. The carrier group chose to signal. The signal without words. Fighter vectors changed, this time visibly. Two aircraft peeled outward, then angled inward, not toward the bomber, but toward the space it would have to pass through to continue its approach. An invisible gate closed. The bomber's path was no longer uncontested. Unverified intercept geometry. Unverified OSINT analysis later suggested the fighters positioned themselves within response distance rather than intercept range, a deliberate choice to deter without forcing a confrontation. No missiles were locked, no radars painted aggressively, but the message was unmistakable. The bomber reconsiders. From the cockpit of the Russian aircraft, the picture had changed. More radar emissions, more tracks, less ambiguity. Carrier fighters don't need to fire to be convincing. Their presence is enough. The silence breaks, but not with words. No radio challenge was issued, no threat transmitted. Instead, the carrier strike group did something more powerful. It kept its course, did not scatter, did not turn away, did not slow. Confidence is deterrence. The big mistake becomes clear. The bomber's approach had forced the US Navy to fully activate its layered defenses. Every sensor now tuned, every operator focused, every contingency rehearsed. What was meant to be a show of pressure had become an intelligence gift. Unverified data collection. Unverified sources later claimed the encounter allowed US forces to collect valuable electronic and behavioral data about bomber operations near carrier groups. No details were released, and such assessments remain speculative. Still, the opportunity was real. The turn. At last, the bomber altered course. Not sharply, not dramatically, but decisively. Its nose shifted away from the carrier's projected path. Altitude stabilized. Speed reduced slightly. The approach was over. Why the turn mattered more than the approach? Because the first side to disengage sets the narrative, even if no one admits it publicly. And this time, it wasn't the carrier. The standoff continues, at distance. For several long minutes, the bomber remained on the periphery. Close enough to watch, far enough to avoid forcing the issue. The fighters held position. The carrier group remained steady. This was equilibrium, tense but controlled. Unverified, command-level awareness. Unverified analysis later suggested the encounter was monitored beyond the tactical level, potentially informing broader operational awareness. No official statements acknowledged such oversight, but encounters like this rarely go unnoticed. Why Moscow didn't push further? Several factors likely weighed heavily, though none were confirmed. The carrier group had demonstrated readiness without escalation. The bomber had lost the element of surprise. Continued approach risked forcing an intercept. Any miscalculation would be catastrophic. Strategic signaling only works if it stops short of consequence. The disengagement. One by one, the signs appeared. The bomber widened its orbit. Its radar emissions changed. Its track drifted away from the carrier's operating box. Eventually, it turned fully away. The sky opened back up. What didn't happen mattered most. No intercept, no missile lock, no warning shots, no press release, just restraint, because restraint preserves options. After the encounter, the real work begins. Long after the bomber vanished from sensors, analysis continued, flight profiles reviewed, timelines compared, decision points dissected. Every second of the encounter became a lesson. Unverified, doctrinal impact. Unverified reporting later suggested the incident influenced training scenarios and readiness discussions related to bomber approaches toward carrier groups. No documentation was released publicly, but patterns evolve quietly. Why this was a big mistake. The bomber intended to project power. Instead, it activated an entire carrier defense ecosystem, revealed operational behavior, reinforced deterrence rather than weakening it. In trying to pressure the carrier, it strengthened the case for readiness. That's the mistake, the strategic takeaway. This encounter was not about starting a war. It was about boundaries. The bomber tested one and found it solid. The carrier strike group demonstrated that it does not need to react loudly to be effective. Sometimes the strongest response is simply being ready. The Russian bomber flew directly toward a US carrier. That decision forced a response. Not explosive, not dramatic, but comprehensive. Layered defenses activated, fighters positioned, control maintained. The bomber turned away, not because it was threatened, but because it was understood. In modern great power competition, the most dangerous moments are often the quiet ones, when machines move, sensors watch, and humans decide how far to push. On this day, over open ocean, one aircraft pushed too far and learned that carriers don't need to chase, they just need to wait.